Someone buried it. Not a volcano, not a landslide, not a slow accumulation of wind-blown sediment over thousands of years. Someone dug up soil and rubble and stone debris, carried it to the site, and deliberately, systematically, layer by layer, filled in one of the most remarkable ceremonial complexes ever built by human hands, and then walked away. This is not a theory. The archaeological evidence for intentional burial at Göbekli Tepe is not disputed. What is disputed, what has been argued over since excavation began in earnest in the 1990s, is why. Why would anyone spend generations constructing something of this scale only to erase it? What were they hiding? What were they afraid of? Or, and this possibility is stranger than it first sounds, what were they preserving? Tonight we are going inside that question. Through the archaeology, through the symbolism of the carvings, through the mainstream explanations and the alternative theories, and through the ground-penetrating radar surveys that have revealed structures still waiting, 3 meters below the surface, that no human eye has seen in 9,000 years. Because the burial of Göbekli Tepe may be the strangest decision ever made by human beings, and we still don't know why they made it. The discovery. In the summer of 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Savak Yildiz was walking across a hillside in southeastern Turkey, and his foot caught something beneath the thin soil. Carved stone. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to look. He recognized immediately this was not a routine discovery. He came back the following year with the team, and he spent the next 22 years of his life at that hilltop. The early years of the excavation were, by Schmidt's own account, disorienting. Not because the finds weren't extraordinary, they were, but because the deeper the team dug, the older and more sophisticated the structures became. The first enclosures revealed in the upper layers were already remarkable. Large T-shaped limestone pillars, elaborate carvings, circular architectural forms, unlike anything from the same period. But then, beneath those enclosures, in the deepest layer, the team found something that made the upper layers look like a later, diminished version of an earlier original. The deeper enclosures were larger, the pillars were bigger, the carvings were more detailed, more varied, more compositionally sophisticated. Whatever tradition Göbekli Tepe represented, it had not been building toward a peak. It had already passed one. The date of the oldest layers, approximately 9,600 BCE, 11,600 years ago. But here is what the radar revealed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the entire hilltop have mapped the subsurface in extraordinary detail. At least 20 enclosures have been identified underground. Some appear to be larger than any that have been excavated. The radar signatures suggest a pattern of enclosures extending across a much wider area of the hill than the current excavations cover. What is currently visible at the surface represents approximately 5% of the site. 95% remains underground. 9,000 years underground, intact, protected by the fill that covered them. Still waiting. And what the remaining 95% might contain. What carvings, what astronomical records, what objects deliberately buried in the fill, is the question this investigation is building toward. Why the site should not exist. The conventional model of human prehistory is based on a well-established sequence. Hunter-gatherers were mobile, temporary. They did not invest in permanent structures, because they couldn't afford to stay long enough to use them. The transition to settled life began with agriculture. Once you could store food, you could stay in one place. Once you could stay in one place, you could build things that last. Agriculture in the Fertile Crescent began approximately 10,000 to 9,000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe was already old by then. Its oldest layers predate the agricultural revolution by roughly 2,000 years. The people who built the earliest enclosures had no surplus food stores, no permanent settlements in the immediate area, no agricultural base to support a large workforce, and yet they quarried stone from a plateau a kilometer away, shaped pillars weighing up to 15 tons, transported those pillars uphill, erected them with precision, carved them with sophisticated imagery, not once, many times, across multiple enclosures built over an extended period. This does not fit the model, and here is the detail that makes it even stranger. The oldest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the deepest, most ancient layers, contain the largest pillars, the most detailed carvings, the most precisely executed layouts. The later layers are smaller, simpler, less refined. The construction tradition was not improving with practice, it was declining. The people who built the earliest enclosures knew more than the people who came after them. That is not what emerging traditions look like. That is what traditions in decline look like, which raises a question that the conventional model has never satisfactorily answered. If Göbekli Tepe was the beginning of something, if these hunter-gatherers were learning to build for the first time, why does their earliest work look like the peak of a tradition that had already existed? What came before it? And where did that knowledge come from? The burial evidence. Let's look at what the evidence actually shows. Because the burial of Göbekli Tepe is not an inference. It is a fact of the physical record that anyone who excavates the site has to account for. The enclosures were filled, systematically with a mixture of materials: soil, stone debris, flint flakes, animal bones, and fragments of carved stone. The fill material was brought to the site. It didn't arrive naturally. Wind-blown sediment would produce a different layering pattern. Water-deposited sediment would sort by particle size. What was found in the fill is a mixture that indicates deliberate deposition. The fill covered the pillars entirely. In some enclosures, it was deep enough to submerge even the largest central pillars, some of them 5 meters tall. But here is the crucial detail. The fill was deposited carefully enough to preserve the site. The pillars are still standing. The stone walls of the enclosures are intact. If the fill had been dumped carelessly, the weight would have damaged or toppled the structures. Instead, what we find is a site treated with care in the act of being concealed. This was not vandalism. This was not the work of enemies destroying a temple. This was reverence. Within the fill material, researchers found specific objects that appear to have been deliberately included rather than accidentally incorporated. Worked flint tools, obsidian blades, bone fragments from feasting, small carved figurines, beads. These were not lost. They were placed. The fill was seeded with the material culture of the communities that had used the site, as if the filling itself was an offering, a last deposit of the sacred objects, the tools, the small precious things that the site had accumulated over its centuries of use. And then, the detail that changes the interpretation entirely. Some of the carved stones in the fill are broken, not damaged by time or pressure, deliberately broken. Fragments of carved pillars, portions of decorated stones, fractured before being deposited. In the archaeological study of ancient ritual sites worldwide, the deliberate breaking of objects before deposition, what archaeologists call killing an object, is a known practice. When an object is ritually killed, it is removed from the world of the living and sent to accompany the dead. If the carved stones at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately broken before burial, then this was not just concealment. It was a ritual, a ceremony of closure, of ending, of sending something permanently into a different state. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe were not just hiding it. They were doing something to it, transforming it, from a place of the living into something else. What was hidden? Before we discuss why, we need to understand what was actually buried here. Because the carvings at Göbekli Tepe are not decoration. They are a vocabulary, a symbolic language. And understanding what that language is saying is essential to understanding why it was eventually covered up. The animals carved into the pillars are wild. Many are dangerous. Many are associated, across ancient cultures worldwide, with death, transformation, and the underworld. Let's start with the Vulture Stone. Pillar 43, sometimes called the Vulture Stone, is one of the most complex carved scenes at the site. A large vulture, wings spread, appears to be balancing a sphere on one wing. Beneath it, headless human figures. To the side, a scorpion. Above, birds in flight. The scene has been interpreted multiple ways, but the sky burial interpretation is strongly supported by other finds. Among the animal remains recovered from Göbekli Tepe are human bones. Some show signs of processing, cut marks consistent with defleshing practices. Defleshing is a component of sky burial, the practice of leaving the dead exposed for carrion birds to consume. Practiced in this region in the Neolithic period. The presence of processed human remains at a site decorated with vulture imagery is not coincidental. Göbekli Tepe may have been, at least in part, a place for managing the dead. A threshold between the living world and whatever the builders believed lay beyond it. The vultures were not just symbols, they may have been participants. And then, in 2017, researchers from Edinburgh University proposed something specific about the Vulture Stone. They argued the scene on Pillar 43 encodes a memory of a comet strike, specifically, the cosmic event associated with the onset of the Younger Dryas, approximately 12,800 years ago. The sphere balanced on the vulture's wing represents a comet. The headless figures represent the dead. The scorpion represents the constellation Scorpius, identifiable at the time of the Younger Dryas. If they are right, then Pillar 43 is not just religious symbolism. It is a record of a catastrophe, a carved, permanent, stone record of the event that may have ended the world those people knew. Which changes the question of why the site was buried entirely. But first, the humanoid pillars. The central T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not purely abstract. They have features that suggest the human form. Some pillars have arms carved along their lower sections, hands meeting at the front. Some have belt-like markings at what would be the waist. Some have necklaces carved in relief. The T-shape is not arbitrary architecture. The pillars may be people, ancestors, gods, beings of some other category that the culture at Göbekli Tepe knew and that we have forgotten. If the pillars are people, then the enclosures are gatherings, assemblies, communities of the living meeting in the presence of the powerful dead, or the watching gods, or both. Think about what it would have been like to stand in one of those enclosures. You are surrounded by stone. The walls rise around you. At the center, two figures, taller than a person, watching. The animals on every surface, vultures, snakes, looking down from the pillars. A parliament of creatures associated with death and transformation, presiding over whatever happens here. The site has no roof. The enclosures are open to the air. Everything here happened in relationship to the sky, which means the enclosures were stages, outdoor theaters, precisely calibrated spaces for ceremonies, conducted under specific skies, at specific times, in the presence of specific stars. And when the ceremony was finally over, they were sealed. The mainstream explanation. To be fair, the mainstream interpretation is a coherent account. It is called ritual closure. In many ancient cultures, sacred spaces were periodically closed as part of a cultural or religious transition. The closing of a sacred space was an act of conclusion, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. At Göbekli Tepe, the enclosures were filled, and new enclosures built nearby. The pattern, fill, build new, is consistent with cyclical renewal. The eventual end of all construction. The mainstream explanation invokes the agricultural transition. Around 8,000 to 7,500 BCE, the region was shifting to settled agricultural life. The ceremonies that Göbekli Tepe served centered on wild animals, on the hunt, on the liminal spaces between the human world and the wild, became less relevant as farming replaced hunting. The ritual complex of a hunter-gatherer cosmology had served its purpose. The burial was the appropriate ceremony for ending a sacred place. This is a coherent explanation. It fits the evidence. It doesn't require anything unusual. But it leaves questions, some of them quite uncomfortable. The mainstream explanation does not fully address why the burial material was brought to the site, rather than simply abandoning it. If you want to end the use of a sacred space, you can simply stop going. Abandonment achieves the goal without the enormous labor of filling the enclosures. The labor involved in the burial was substantial. Enormous quantities of fill were brought to a hilltop and carefully deposited. Not the work of an afternoon, a prolonged, organized, collective effort. Why? What was the burial doing that simple abandonment could not? And there is a specific issue with the timing. Göbekli Tepe was used for more than 1,500 years alongside the emerging agricultural communities around it. The two traditions coexisted for centuries, which means the agricultural transition did not automatically make the site irrelevant. Something more specific happened, something that made multiple communities, because this was a shared site, maintained by coalitions across a wide region, agree that the time had finally come to close the doors. Whatever that something was, it was convincing enough to unite communities that had been coming to this hilltop for generations. Something made them all agree. The mainstream explanation cannot tell us what that something was. The alternative explanations. The alternative interpretations are not wild speculation. They are responses to genuine gaps in the conventional explanation. The first, catastrophe memory. The Younger Dryas began approximately 12,800 years ago. Göbekli Tepe's oldest layers date to approximately 9,600 BCE, precisely when the Younger Dryas was ending. 100 years after the worst of the catastrophe lifted, someone was building this. The specific claim, made by the Edinburgh team that analyzed Pillar 43, is that Göbekli Tepe was built partly as a memorial. Encoded in the animal imagery and astronomical alignments was a record of the catastrophe that had happened before, and perhaps a warning about what could happen again. If this interpretation is correct, then the eventual burial takes on a specific meaning. The memorial had served its purpose. The knowledge it was built to preserve had been transmitted, incorporated into the agricultural communities developing around the site, and the original monument could now be safely closed. Not abandoned, not destroyed. Sealed, protected, preserved underground for a future that the builders could not specify, but somehow anticipated. The second, deliberate preservation. What if the burial was an act of protection? What if the people who buried Göbekli Tepe did so because they believed the site was in danger? If they believed the site would be destroyed by conflict, by the encroaching agricultural communities whose worldview was incompatible with the hunter-gatherer cosmology the site represented, then the burial could have been an act of deliberate preservation, not for their own generation, for whoever came next. This interpretation is consistent with the care of the burial. The site wasn't damaged in the filling process. The pillars are standing. The carvings are intact. The buried enclosures are, in a very real sense, better preserved for having been covered. And it is consistent with something that happened in 1994. A shepherd's foot caught a carved stone, and the secret of 9,000 years ended. Whether that discovery was an accident or the fulfillment of an intention, an ancient decision to hide something for a future that could understand it, we cannot say. But the builders of Göbekli Tepe could not have known when they covered their pillars whether anyone would ever find them. They buried them anyway. That is either faith or something stranger. The third, knowledge transmission. There is a version of this that does not require a full-scale lost civilization. It requires only this, that some group of people, in the period immediately after the Younger Dryas ended, possessed knowledge of astronomy, of the sky, of sacred significance, sophisticated enough to encode in a large-scale architectural program, and that they built Göbekli Tepe, at least in part, to transmit that knowledge to the communities that would follow. Not through writing. They had no writing. Through example. Through the practice of building and conducting ceremonies and pointing at the sky and saying, "This is what happened. This is what you must remember." As the original knowledge holders died and were replaced by people with less direct access to the original knowledge, the tradition simplified. The later enclosures are smaller and less elaborate because the people who built them understood less. Until finally, when the tradition had faded to the point where the site could no longer serve its original function, the remaining practitioners made a decision to close what could no longer be maintained, to bury what could no longer be used, to preserve it in the dark for a future that might be ready to understand it. The oldest work is the best work. That fact has never been satisfactorily explained, and it is the one that makes the most stubborn demand for a different kind of answer. The structures still underground. Göbekli Tepe is not alone, In the past decade, a constellation of related sites has been identified across the same region of southeastern Turkey, now called Taş Tepeler, Stone Hills. Karahan Tepe, about 40 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, has been under active excavation since 2019. What has been found there is extraordinary. A carved chamber with a human head emerging from the bedrock itself, as if a figure is buried in the living rock, pressing upward through the stone. Multiple human figures carved directly into the bedrock, their faces visible above the surface, while their bodies remain embedded below. A niche containing a cluster of carved phalluses, some with faces carved into their surfaces, emerging from the rock like a congregation of watching presences. The imagery is more explicitly humanoid than Göbekli Tepe, and the carving technique, figures emerging from the bedrock itself rather than placed on separate pillars, suggests a related but distinct symbolic vocabulary. Other sites in the Taş Tepeler region are being investigated. Some may predate Göbekli Tepe's oldest layers. Some may have been buried in similar fashion. The region of southeastern Turkey was a center of monumental ritual activity for at least 2,000 years, beginning at the end of the Younger Dryas and winding down as the agricultural transition took hold. And at Göbekli Tepe itself, 95% is still underground. The unexcavated enclosures may contain more complex carvings than anything found so far. The excavated sample is small. The possibility that more elaborate symbolic programs, more detailed astronomical records, more complex mythological scenes exist in the unexcavated areas cannot be excluded. Some researchers have also proposed that the hilltop may have been chosen partly because of natural features in the bedrock beneath it. Limestone develops natural cavities, caves, chambers, voids created by the slow dissolution of rock by acidic groundwater. If natural chambers exist beneath the site, if the builders chose this hilltop partly because of what was below it, the relationship between the surface structures and the subsurface takes on a completely different dimension. Ground-penetrating radar is not designed to image deep subsurface voids. Its penetration at Göbekli Tepe has been sufficient to map the buried enclosures, but not to characterize the deeper geology. Whether natural chambers exist beneath the site, and whether those chambers were known to the builders, is unknown and uninvestigated. The question of what is hidden at Göbekli Tepe is larger than the question of what is in the unexcavated enclosures. It extends, potentially, into the rock itself. Why bury it? Let's return to the question we started with. Not why would anyone use such a site? Not why would anyone stop using it? Why would anyone spend the time, energy, and organizational effort to systematically fill it in? We have 4 candidate answers. First, ritual closure. The site was closed as a ceremony of cultural transition. The burial was the appropriate conclusion for a sacred space whose active function was ending. Second, agricultural displacement. The cosmology that Göbekli Tepe served became irrelevant as communities transitioned to farming. The site was buried because it belonged to a world that no longer existed. Third, catastrophe memory. The site was built as a memorial to the Younger Dryas events and buried when the knowledge it was preserving had been transmitted to the communities that would carry it forward. Fourth, deliberate preservation. The site was buried to protect it from an anticipated threat, conflict, cultural erasure, with the hope or the intention that he would be found again. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. Two or more could be true simultaneously. But here is the question that sits beneath all four. The question that, once you see it, is hard to ignore. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe could have done nothing. They could have simply stopped going. The site would have been gradually covered by wind-blown sediment over millennia and lost. Instead, they invested the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of person-hours in filling it in carefully, deliberately, with objects selected and placed according to a logic we can see but not fully read. That investment demands an explanation. And the explanation, whatever it is, tells us something fundamental about the people who made it, about how they thought about time, about what they believed mattered enough to preserve, about what they were doing for someone who wasn't them. Because here is the thing that the burial of Göbekli Tepe makes clear about the people who made it. They were thinking about the future, not next year, not the next generation. A future so distant they couldn't imagine it. A future in which the covered hill would look like a natural feature of the landscape. The builders themselves long gone. The tradition they represented perhaps entirely lost. And they decided what lay beneath was worth preserving into that future. That act requires a specific kind of temporal imagination, the ability to project not years or decades, but centuries or millennia forward. The ability to imagine people you will never meet and to care about what they will find. We like to think of this kind of long-term thinking as a modern virtue. The burial of Göbekli Tepe suggests it may be much older than civilization, or that civilization, in some form we haven't fully recognized, may be much older than we think. The pillars wait, still standing in the dark, in the enclosures that haven't been opened, still carved, still detailed, still encoding whatever the builders needed the future to know. The carvings wait. The questions wait. And underneath the hill, 3 meters down, 9,000 years of fill above them, whatever message was carved into the stone is still there, intact, waiting for the moment when we uncover it. And whether it answers the question of why this place was buried or deepens it further, we don't yet know. But the people who buried it could not have imagined the world that would eventually find it, could not have imagined the technology that would see through the soil to what lay beneath without touching it, could not have imagined us. And yet here we are, 9,000 years later, still listening.